All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Cloud Migration, What You Need to Know. So my name is Maddie Regis. I am the marketing coordinator at NetGain Technologies, and I'm going to go ahead and let our two speakers introduce themselves. So I'm going to pass it over first to Shane.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Shane Wendel. I'm a consulting engineer with NetGain Technologies. Been with NetGain about 3.5 years, and one of my responsibilities is to help clients figure out what and if they can move to the cloud.
Great, thank you so much, Shane. And Dustin, how about you?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dustin Nichols. I'm a consulting systems engineer with NetGain for about 7 years now, with a strong focus on assisting companies with their cloud migration strategy. And I will apologize in advance. I have a 12-month-old who he's getting a little loud in the background.
It's all, we're all working from home. I think we all understand the struggle. So no worries there. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I think kind of the first element when organizations are considering moving to the cloud, there's a list of sort of decision factors that they have to take into account. So I want you all to kind of discuss that before we get into the second aspect of our presentation today, which will be more of a case study of cloud migration. So Shane, why don't you start us off with sort of the overall environment examination and then cost assessment as well, which is obviously always a big factor.
Yeah, so technological environment, that's more about what you have, right? What applications you're running, what is the architecture of those applications, and how will they be affected by going to the cloud? So one of the items might be vendor support. Does your application vendor support that application running in the cloud? Do they have their own cloud offering? And then, how is that application structured? So some applications, particularly those that have, like a traditional fit client, are latency sensitive and may not be happy with moving from an on-premise low latency network to a high latency network based on, wide area internet connectivity. And then, obviously cost is a big factor. So one of the things you have to think about when moving things to the cloud, particularly on the infrastructure side, so if we're talking about moving servers to the cloud, there's all these little things that go into how much that server costs that you don't necessarily think about with on-prem infrastructure. So for instance, storage transactions, reading and writing to storage may generate cost. Egress bandwidth, so the amount of data that you are sending back from your cloud server to your on-premises environment may be a cost. So you have all these variable costs that you don't necessarily consider when you're sizing on-premises infrastructure.
Absolutely. Dustin, you have anything to add to that? Oh, Dustin, I think you're muted still.
Sorry. Yeah, I think you also, when it comes to the technological environment, you also have to consider the user experience as well. So keeping in mind how your user interacts at your main site may be different how your remote users today interact with your applications at your main site.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, as an employee who's also an end user, I know that's definitely important for me. So Dustin, I'll have you take the next point on our slide, which is, not everything can move to the cloud. So why don't you discuss a little bit about that point of what moves to the cloud, what doesn't?
Yeah, so you really got to understand what you can move to the cloud. If your vendor supports it, moving an application to the cloud, great. If it doesn't, then you have to, kind of figure out what your options are going to be for that application. The other things you have to consider too is as Shane pointed out, is going to be your, latency. So this, goes big into the network connectivity side. You really got to lay out your assessment so you know what's moving, where it's moving, and how you're going to get it there.
Yeah, absolutely. Shane, anything to add to that?
No, I think that covers it, and we overlapped a little bit, but some of those factors are pretty important for several categories. So.
Right, of course. So Dustin, you mentioned sort of bandwidth and network connectivity. So that is our next point, which I think is maybe something that people don't realize is an important element of cloud migration. So why don't you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to moving to the public cloud, so like Azure, for instance, most of that traffic is going to go over the public internet, which you have no control over. So the more bandwidth you can have to get your get your information from your on-premise to the cloud and get it back from the cloud back to your on-premise is very important.
Definitely. Shane, again, you got anything else you want to pop in there?
Yeah, one of the considerations for that too is that what bandwidth is available in your area. So you may not have multiple options, particularly if your location is in a somewhat remote or rural area. You may have a limited selection of carriers that you can choose from and what bandwidth they have available. So that affects your decision. As far as what of your applications and workloads can move to the cloud.
Yeah, I think I know NetGain has experience with some of those more rural clients, so definitely reach out to us if you're in that kind of situation. So I think then the next point we've got is backup and disaster recovery, which is always an important element of your data management. So Shane, I'll have you speak to that point.
Yeah, so this is where we get in a little bit to maybe some misconceptions about moving things to the cloud, particularly on the software as a service side, but even on the infrastructure as a service side. There's a tendency for management in particular to think that if they move things to the cloud, then Microsoft or Amazon or whoever is now suddenly taking care of things like backup and disaster recovery. And that's not the case. You still need to plan for those things. Even on the Office 365 side, Microsoft has a limited number of days that they maintain retention for. So you do have to look at like a cloud-to-cloud backup option. And then on the server side, you still have to plan retention policies and recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives, just the same way you would with on-premises infrastructure. It's just that you're maybe building it with different software than you would on-premises.
Gotcha. Dustin, anything to add to that point?
No, I think Shane nailed that perfectly. Just remember to consider, just because you're going away from on-prem, just keep in mind that you still need backup and disaster recovery planning.
Yep, absolutely. So I think our final point here on just the decision factors of moving to the cloud is your IT team. And I think that there's some misconceptions around that as well. So Shane, why don't you explain kind of what's involved in that?
Yeah, I think, again, as you mentioned, this is another misconception. So, especially maybe at the management level, is that by moving things to the cloud, you can eliminate your IT team, whether that is on-premises IT or managed services. But while that may be true that your IT team can do more with less, just the reality of the public cloud and public cloud services is that there's a lot of complexity that can be there. And the other factor is you don't have a lot of control over the rate of change. So with on-premises applications, you can install an application that you bought a perpetual license for and use that application until it absolutely won't work anymore. And nothing changes in the way that application operates. In the cloud, when you're subscribed to cloud services or you're using infrastructure as a service in the cloud, Microsoft or Amazon or whoever it is can add and remove features at any time that may affect how your applications operate. And usually they will give you a notice and say that this will be changing on this certain date. But the fact that it is changing, you don't have any control over. So there's things that you need someone to manage your cloud resources for.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say in some ways it's almost like adding another element um, to your overall infrastructure that you have to manage. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, you have uh, you do have this rich feature set of things that you may not have had access to on-prem, but someone has to learn how to use those things.
Yeah. Dustin, anything to add to how cloud migration can affect your IT team?
Yeah, I think Shane nailed that one as well. But I will say that your on-premise IT team no longer has to focus on hardware on site. Now they can focus on the cloud. Your management team no longer has to worry about protecting that hardware on site and making sure your warranties are up to date. So you'll need your IT team to help you manage that as well.
All right, great. So now, our audience has kind of got an idea of the elements they need to keep in mind when thinking about moving to the cloud. So now we're going to move into the next portion of our presentation, which is our case study of Santa's Workshop. So that is our fake company that we've created. Dustin and Shane and I have discussed, what they have seen in the field and kind of compiled typical clients and mashed it all into one so we can sort of give you all an idea of what it would look like to migrate to the cloud. So to kind of summarize up Santa's Workshop and their overall environment, they have 100 total end users and they have 3 different sites. They've got one main site and 2 branches. You can see the main site's the North Pole there, and then we've got a couple other workshops. They currently have some physical servers and an on-prem data center. And since they have a lot of inventory and manufacturing, they use an enterprise resource planning application. So latency is a concern for them. They need quick communication between their servers. And then, as usual, they have a file server and Active Directory and are currently using Microsoft Exchange 2013. And I apologize, my dog might bark a little bit in the background, working from home, folks. Um, they their workshops use remote access in order to connect to the main site, and then if they have any remote workers as well, they will use a VPN. And finally, they need a year retention of data, and they have about a 24-hour tolerance of downtime. So that's just going to all be important elements to understand as we're explaining how Santa's Workshop will be moving to the cloud. All right, so now that we've got all of those elements in mind, I'm going to pass it back and forth to Shane and Dustin to kind of explain, how this process works, how this pretend client will be moving to the cloud from start to finish. So Shane, let's start with the assessment of their environment.
Yeah, so I think this is important. Unless you have a very small environment, this is something that we would typically recommend. So what this consists of is that we would come in and run a variety of tools over a period of time, usually about 2 weeks. And what these tools do is meter the usage of all of those servers in particular. So, again, why that's important is to figuring out what moving those things to the cloud is going to cost you. So, while you can look at consoles and determine maybe storage and CPU and memory, the things that you need to run those tools for, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, would be things like bandwidth utilization and maybe storage traffic. So again, reading and writing to the disk. Those are things that you really can't collect without running that tool set.
Dustin, anything to add to that first step of environment assessment?
Nothing to add.
All right, great. So let's go ahead and move on to the next point, which is engaging carriers for network connectivity, as we discussed at the beginning of the presentation. Shane?
Yeah, so again, we just want to find out what's available in your area. Obviously, if we are starting from something small, let's say you have a 50 meg connection with 100 users, then that's probably not sufficient. and we want to see what's available. So we partner with companies like Bandwidth that are telecom brokers that will actually work with the various carriers in your area to find you the best option.
All right, Dustin, got anything for that point? Anything to add about?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, a lot of times when we're doing these, is we run into there's no available bandwidth options. So, and what you'll see as part of our case study here is one of those issues, we're going to run into where the remote workshops don't have anything better.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure there's a variety of instances that you can run into, since there are so many different scenarios. But the next point that we have is something that we discussed earlier on as well, which is the vendor support requirements. So Dustin, I'll turn this one over to you first. Why don't you go into what's involved in that part of the process?
Yeah, so when we start, as part of the overall assessment, is we're going to check with your application vendors to find out, A, do they support public cloud? Or B, do they support any hypervisor? Most application vendors are supporting at least a hypervisor now, whether that's VMware or Hyper-V. So typically we can usually get some support from vendors to support a public cloud, so Azure or Amazon.
Shane, anything to add to that point?
Yeah, I mean, we would do exactly what Dustin said, but we have had cases. I have one particular egregious example in mind where a vendor would only support their application running in Azure if that server instance was running in their Azure tenant. So that would be, something that you would have to consider. It was also much more expensive than it would be to just take that server from the client's environment and move it into the cloud environment, significantly more expensive. So, those are just things that you have to figure out during the process.
Absolutely. And so then I think the next point we've gotten, and Dustin may have touched on this slightly earlier on, but we've got this this proof of concept. So Dustin, why don't you explain to our audience what that entails?
Yeah, when you have an environment that has say a enterprise resource management or planning, application, you want to be able to test that in the cloud before you move your production environment, up and start using it. So the proof of concept will allow us to kind of migrate or copy the server up to the cloud, run it, get users on it and test it. And then that lets us know, hey, it's going to work, or we need to go back to the drawing board and see, what do we need to do to make it work? Or do we just say it's not going to, be runnable in the cloud, so let's leave it on-prem and redesign the solution to meet that need.
Yeah, so like you said, it's kind of a test run of everything, make sure it all goes smoothly.
Yeah.
Okay, Shane, anything to add about the proof of concept, the test run?
Yeah, and it's important there also to make sure that we are testing how the user experience changes as well. So, not just the fact of whether the application can or cannot run, but if it does, if we are changing how it is accessed, and we need to make sure that that's acceptable to our client as an IT shop. So the business users who use the application.
Definitely. So then we've assessed everything. We've made sure the internet can handle it. We've moved through all our steps, and we are at the point of the full migration. So Shane, why don't you start us off with that final step?
Yeah, so this is going to depend on what we're migrating, right? So, in the case of something like Office 365, there's a pretty well defined migration path that you can kind of stand things up in parallel and have some users still in your on-prem and some users actually moving to the cloud, and do that kind of incrementally. In the case of server workloads, so infrastructure as a service, typically we are almost we're adding the cloud environment to your on-premise environment almost as a secondary site, and then we're replicating those server workloads up into the cloud and then kind of failing them over, just like we would if we were using a cloud disaster recovery solution.
Gotcha. Dustin, anything to add about the full migration step?
Yeah, and during the full migration is when you're really going to rely on your IT team, any partner that you're using to help you do the migration, as well as vendor support. So you'll want to make sure that everybody's in coordination and everybody is ready on the day that you start actually performing the migrations.
Absolutely. Communication is always key. I think that's something we all hear all the time. All right, so we've seen these steps and discussed kind of how the migration goes. So now that we've seen the before of Santa's workshop, let's go ahead and move to the after. So this is their post-cloud migration situation. So Shane, I'll turn it over to you first to explain their connectivity changes.
Yeah, so as Dustin mentioned before, in the case of Santa's workshop being as remote as they are, we have found that there's really not any other options for changing up their connectivity. So no increases of bandwidth at any of the sites. So we have to, design the rest of the environment based on those constraints. And then the other change that would happen is that we would actually create that additional connection to the Azure data center. So in this case, we're using Microsoft Azure. So we would create a VPN connection from their main site to the Azure data center to allow data to move back and forth from those two locations.
Great. Okay, so then after the connectivity point, we've got their overall new cloud footprint. So Dustin, why don't you take us through that?
Yeah, so in the case of Santa's workshop, they were using Exchange 2013. So we went ahead and just chose to migrate their email to Office 365. So with that, we stood up a new hybrid Exchange server in the cloud. The hybrid Exchange server will allow for management of user properties and attributes that are in Active Directory, and allow them to continue to create their groups and do a lot of what your IT team would do normally for creating user accounts on premise and having the password sync up to Office 365. The next thing we did is we moved to the ERP, or the Enterprise Resource Planning application, to the cloud as well, along with the remote desktop server. So this will allow all the users now to access the ERP through the remote desktop server. So now your users on the main site are accessing ERP just the way that the remote sites were working. And this is all due to bandwidth because the ERP application was latency sensitive. We also replicated the file server from on-prem to the cloud, and we stood up a new Active Directory server in the cloud. With this, basically, we reduced the footprint from 4 servers that were on premise. Now we're down to 2 virtual servers. That's a file and print server, which is being replicated to the cloud. The reason why we did this is for the user experience. So the remote sites were accessing the files, and they were used to the latency and how long it took to pull the files down. But the users at the main site were not used to that latency. So to keep their user experience the same, we decided to keep a file server on premise, but replicate those files to the cloud. So at any time they could get rid of that file and print server if they chose to. And then also we kept an Active Directory server on site for that file and print server, but also for local survivability of authentication for your users, or for the users that were at the main site.
All right, I think that was definitely a lot of information that we just covered there in those next 2 points. So Shane, you have anything you want to add to that would be important information for our audience to know?
Yeah, again, I just want to highlight what Dustin mentioned. So, by taking the ERP application and moving it up to the cloud, we're changing that user experience for the main site user. So the way we mitigate that is with remote desktop access. But then, as he mentioned, the remote sites were already used to that type of access, so there's no real user experience change for them. And then, as far as what we keep on-prem, talking about user experience enhancement, that's important because, again, you've got users, the majority of your users at a main site that are used to very low latency, fast access to those files, and moving them to, using those files over a high latency, lower bandwidth connection would probably not work for the majority of the users, especially in, departments like accounting, marketing in particular.
Great. So then we've got our last element of Santa's workshop after their migration, and that is their backup. So Shane, why don't you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, again, as I mentioned earlier when we were talking about this, so we still have to configure backup. It's not automatic. So what we do is, while there is backup options available in Azure that are built in, so it's quite on the nose, called Azure Backup, we still have to create our policies. So in this case, we created a backup every day, so to keep that 24-hour RPO and RTO. And then, we build a retention policy to keep the data for a year. And then the other important thing is that we enable geo-redundant storage. So what this means is that there is a backup that occurs to the same Azure region as where your servers are primarily located, and then that data is replicated to another Azure region. So if there was some instance that was to take out an entire Azure region, which I have to say would be a pretty significant, type of a disaster, you would then be able to recover your data to another Azure region and bring your workloads back up. So all the Azure regions kind of work in a pair, and when you choose geo-redundant storage, they replicate the data across. The other thing I want to mention, going back to the local servers, is that we don't have to back those up anymore because we have our files replicated to the server in Azure that has been backed up, and then Active Directory server just kind of inherently that's a replicated server. So those servers on-prem, I say they kind of become throwaway servers. So if they go down, yes, the user experience will change, but they're not affecting your operations other than user experience, and they're not critical to the environment operating.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about the geo-redundant storage, because you always hope for the best, plan for the worst, right? That's what everyone says. So all right, great. So that kind of goes over Santa's workshop and our little case study there. And again, that's kind of compiling different elements that both Shane and Dustin have seen in their experience helping real life clients move to the cloud. So Dustin, I think let's go ahead and kind of wrap up. Do you have any sort of final thoughts before we move on to our Q&A?
Yeah, one of the things I just, the cloud is not for everybody, every business, but most you can move something to the cloud. In particular, email is one of the ones that I think, get it off on, being on premise, get that up to the cloud. Don't have to worry about supporting that application. Your IT team can focus more on your business and other applications that you have in your environment. So even if it's just something, move into the cloud, at least, to get your foot, jump in and get your feet wet with it. I think it's very beneficial to businesses as they move forward and grow.
Awesome. Thank you. Shane, final thoughts?
Yeah. One thing I just want to point out is, again, this is just one way to do it. So in our case study, as we go through the process with this particular client, this is what worked best for them. But there's other ways to do it. As Dustin mentioned, most companies can probably move something to the cloud, but the magic is deciding what you can move to the cloud. So one example, that we might change in this particular case is maybe that file server goes away, and we move file access to something like Microsoft Teams and Microsoft OneDrive, which is a cloud file sharing, those are cloud file sharing applications. And to make that decision, you would have to, again, go back to your assessment and look at how are we using the file server, what is integrating with the file server, if anything, and what kind of files are users using, right? So again, just want to point out that this is not the way we would do it necessarily every time. This is just what fit best for the client, and that's what we can help you determine.
I would like to go ahead and start with our question and answer section of the presentation. So, if you have any sort of burning questions that you've got about cloud migration that we maybe didn't answer during the presentation, now would be the time to submit them. So let me go ahead and take a look here. Let's look at this first question. All right, we've got one question here. Someone wants to know, how long do assessments take? So Shane, do you want to maybe start us off with the answer, and then I'll pass it over to Dustin?
Yeah, for my end, when we're talking about running those tools that I mentioned earlier, I typically want to collect at least about 2 weeks of data, because we want to try to get the highs and the lows. If you have some kind of seasonal business, for instance, if you're retail or manufacturing, where like the Christmas season, greatly affects the amount of business you're doing, maybe we want to do the assessment during that time, so that we can make sure that whatever we do, we can handle those peaks in your utilization.
Gotcha. Dustin, anything to add about the assessment process and the timeline there?
Yeah, when you're looking to do an assessment of your environment, also consider if you have end of month or beginning of month accounting or other processes that run in your environment. Let us know, or let whoever's going to do the assessment know, so we know to schedule those assessments to cover that time frame as well. And the typical time frame is 14 days or 2 weeks. You may want to go longer. You may want to capture more just to get a better understanding of what's going on in your environment.
Gotcha. So that one seems like there's a typical period, but then like with everything with the cloud migration, it's specific to your business as well. So if you have any questions about the assessment, again, feel free to reach out to us. And then it looks like we've got a good second question here. Is the cloud more secure than on-premise? And I think I'll have Dustin start off with that one.
It can be. I think it all depends on what you're putting in place. There's a lot of security features available for specifically Azure and Microsoft 365. If you look at some of the security features and the things that are included in some of the licensing bundles, if you implement those like MFA or multi-factor authentication, that boosts your security. So it's not unsecure, but you still have to do some things to maintain the security of your environment and your data. That goes beyond what Microsoft does for their physical security of like their data centers and the security of your data that's in their data centers.
Gotcha. Shane, anything to add there about cloud security?
Yeah, again, physical security, like as Dustin mentioned, for sure, because now your data is in a well-guarded, well-protected, disaster-proofed as much as possible data center. So no one can go just kind of steal your server and run off with your data. But again, from a logical security standpoint, all the things that you have to configure for on-prem, you still have to configure, as we mentioned when we were talking about IT staff. You can certainly turn on cloud resources without configuring all the security that's available, and they can actually end up being less secure than on-premise.
All right, yeah, so it's important to keep all of that in mind when you are considering or completing a cloud migration. All right, it looks like those are all the questions that we have. So I'd just like to thank everyone very much for joining us today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.